call on me. Some of you may have been at last month's meeting, but if not, here is a list I've left at the table of possible titles to select from for next year. And I'd like to add two more that three more. Jane just mentioned to me Little Liar by Mitch Albom. It's gotten great reviews, if anyone has read that. The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. That has gotten very good reviews. If anyone has read that, please let me know. And the third one is West Side Rising by Shar Miller, who is I believe, retired professor at Trinity. And it's a story about the history of the west side of San Antonio. So those are three more titles I would like to add to this list. And if you all have had a chance to read any of these and liked them or did not like them, please let me know. Most of these titles are ones that I have just heard about. I haven't had a chance to read much the last few months, but anyway, so I don't know about many of these books. So I would really appreciate your thoughts if you have read something and would recommend it or not. And that there's additional copies of this list on the back table. Thank you.
I think this year particularly we appreciate you're all helping out by reading and making recommendations. I mean, Shelley does have something else to do besides just read books this year. So we appreciate you, Shelley. Thank you. Okay, and as long as we're talking about WOC, there are cards about the ladies' night out, both on the coffee table and the table back where you signed in. So if anybody's interested, it's got full details. I'm not going to get into that, but you can sign up, on Sundays or online if you're interested in doing that. And the spring luncheon will be coming, and by next month we'll have cards and information on that. Thank the refreshment committee. And Jane, we've covered that. Okay, I think it's time for Ellen Fraser to come up and give us her facts from 50 years ago.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
So you all know that last summer we decided to have a look back 50 years ago. We're on January 1974 now. And I've put them up here. I've had several people tell me the print was too small on my whiteboard. So we're going to do this. So we're going to go forward with this. So again, what I start with is Dr. Zabinden's sermons. So January 6th, first Sunday of Epiphany, A Star in the East. And then a new look at some old words, hope. Now this was first in a series, Hope, Faith, Love, and Judgment. And January 27 was a new look at some old words, faith. January 20, Reverend Wood gave the sermon. That was the third Sunday of Epiphany. And that was a new look at some old words, love. That was also the date of the baptism of Betsy, or Elizabeth Merriweather, by Reverend Wood and Reverend Ryan. Something cool on the 27th at 9 a.m., the youth put on a play called Jonah. Joe-N-A, and it was a contemporary version of Jonah, the story of Jonah. All January on TV, on WOAI at 9 a.m., Reverend Zabinden and Reverend Wood gave a program called At Your Service. In the newsletter, Reverend Bill Wood received his letter to be awarded the Doctorate of Theology from Union Theological in May. On January 27, dedication of the new sanctuary doors and the new transoms at the entry. They are just stunning, 50 years ago, January of 74. And they were a gift of Mr. and Mrs. Pat Camp, honoring Dr. George Mosé. And at that time, they were living in Rockport, and he was serving as an interim minister at Aransas Pass Presbyterian. The Heritage Room, right here, taking shape is what it said in the newsletter. There's a donated rug and a chest and framed photos of the ministers. And that's the Heritage Room for you all who haven't looked up to see the brass plaque. New earphone pews were marked audio pew in the sanctuary. So that was 50 years ago, the brass audio pew markers. Something I think is interesting, Reverend Ryan put together a contact club. And that was for visiting prospective members, procedures and methods. I think that's pretty cool. Contact club. And of course, it's January, so there was the call for the nominations of elders and deacons. And this was for the class of 78. January 4th, the Church Women United had a noon luncheon with Reverend Dick Ryan as the speaker. Then the Wednesday family night dinners and study of Jeremiah continued. January 20 started SNAC, S-N-A-C, Sunday night at church. I like that. It was a 50-cent snack supper, 50 cents. And that was the kickoff date. January 22 was the Council of Churches dinner, the luncheon for Travelers Aid, and the Literacy Council. January's busy just like it is today. The women's luncheon, the speaker was Reverend T. Watson Street of First Presbyterian of Kingsville. Then the women's discussion continued at 30, a question of order, further discussion of Jeremiah. The book for January 74 was The Plague by Albert Camus, led by Reverend Bill Wood. So outside of FPC, as always, I give you a little peek outside. Mayor Charles Becker, Governor Dolph Briscoe, Senators John Tower and Lloyd Bentsen, Richard Nixon, 37th President. And you've heard this over the months, Watergate is unfolding and it's going to continue to unfold. And at this point on January 4th, he refused to hand over the tapes. So many of you may remember that. January 6th, daylight savings time started in response to the energy crisis. Now, January 1 of 74, you need to remember this. That's when Social Security started paying aged, blind, and disabled out of our Social Security money. January 74. That was the first big drain. And the second one, if you're interested, was George Bush borrowed $1.37 trillion from Social Security funds for the Iraq War, never to be paid back. So if you're wondering where the money came, those are the two things that drained our Social Security. USA national speed limit, 55. That's when it started, January 74. And this, I think, is cool. Dr. Christian Bernard performed the first heart transplant, and it was adding a new heart without removing the old one. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting. As I said, I like to peek outside and see what we have beyond FPC. So Rice Stadium hosted Super Bowl. The Dolphins beat the Vikings 24-7. And Larry Zonka, if you all remember him, he was the MVP. World Football League was founded. And Ray Kroc of McDonald's buys the San Diego Padres for $12 million. And those of you who are baseball fans like me, the San Diego Padres, we know them because here in San Antonio, the Missions team is a farm team to the Padres. So Happy Days began their 11-year run on ABC. Jaws was published, Peter Benchley. The $6 Million Man started on ABC. And of course, I have to find the two top hits. If we make it through December, Merle Haggard, we all know that. Most of you should. And Time in the Bottle, Jim Croce. So thank you all again very, very much for your interest in history and your love of the written word. Thank you very, very much. And I need to do some connectivity here for Richard, so give me just a minute. And Grace, you can go ahead and start while I do this technical side.
I might add that Ellen also keeps busy as treasurer of WOC.
I'm free time. Okay, and let me get him connected. Okay. That's okay. I think we're set. He's got an Apple and I have a PC, so we have to do just a little bit of a change. So go ahead, Fred.
Okay, we're good.
I've got one more thing I have to do, but you go ahead.
Okay. Well, once again, it's exciting to have a brand new reviewer.
Not the other way.
Okay.
We moved the camera, so
Oh, okay. Are we good?
you're fine.
Okay. Anyway, I'm very happy to be able to present a new reviewer to you today, Dr. Richard Taylor, Rick. Rick and Deborah. Deborah, where are you? She's in the back, okay. They are members of PFC. They have 4 adult children and 10 grandchildren. Beyond church, Jim and I, my Jim and I, have something else very much in common with Rick. 7 years ago, Jim and I moved here from Plymouth, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit, 15 minutes from the Ann Arbor Stadium. Rick was born in Detroit. He lived in Howell, Michigan. He graduated from the University of Michigan in 1979. From there, he attended medical school at University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. He returned to the University of Michigan for his residency in internal medicine and pediatrics. He then did a fellowship at U of M in pediatric critical care and stayed at the University of Michigan for graduate work. In 1995, he returned to Texas, San Antonio, full-time faculty member of the University of Texas Health Science Center as professor of pediatric critical care, and he did this until 2019. I bet he could also do a very interesting presentation on pediatric critical care too. I don't know if we'd all understand it, but I bet he could. Anyway, it's wonderful to have him here today to discuss Facing the Mountain. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. Okay. Let's see.
Technology is wonderful, and I think the pictures are worth waiting for.
Okay, there. Sorry, a little delay there. So, yeah, my name's Rick Taylor, and I'm going to review Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II by Daniel James Brown. Mr. Brown is listed in Wikipedia as an American author for narrative nonfiction books. He attended Diablo Valley College and then got a Bachelor's of Arts degree from UC Berkeley and subsequently got a Master's of Arts degree from UCLA. He's authored several books. You may be aware of The Boys in the Boats, and then a number of other books as well. So, Facing the Mountain is it's not just one story, it's like many stories. And it will be impossible for me to actually tell you all the stories. There's stories about people generally and what individuals experienced and what they experienced with their family and their fellow soldiers, et cetera. So I'm going to try to give you the overview and a little bit of some of the individual stories, but mostly more the overview. So there's the major threads of this book. This is a history It gives a history of Japanese immigration and incorporation into United States society, specifically in the late 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. We'll talk about the response of the United States government and the people to Pearl Harbor in World War II, and the response of the Japanese Americans to the war. One of the major themes of the book is the heroic performance of the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit in World War II, which was a unit of almost entirely Nisei Japanese American soldiers. And they performed very valiantly, and we'll cover that. There's individual stories and accounts, there's heroes, there's some people who weren't quite so heroic, and there were some people who were just ordinary people. I won't cover a lot of individual stories, but maybe a little bit. So what perspectives does this book take? Well, there is some perspective of trying to point out the injustice and discrimination and failure of our lofty goals enshrined in our Constitution in regards to treatment of certain people. However, he does cover that, and that's really important. I find this book to be much more positive, though. It talks about resilience, about people doing what needs to be done and trying to be faithful to the country, and talking about determination, grit, perseverance, heroism, loyalty, patriotism. I think he emphasizes the positive, but there's some negatives that need to be covered. So me, I'm not a historian, and I'm not really trying to make a presentation as a historian. I am reporting on what this book discusses in terms of history. I have done some fact checking, because nowadays when I read it, I read it on an iPad, and it's so easy to just like check a fact. You go to the internet, and I have to say that the facts that I've checked have all panned out. But I am portraying the history as portrayed in this book. I'm not trying to be really a history expert. I also have some skin in the game. So I married Deborah Mishimoto, and this is some of the skin I have in the game. These are all our progeny, and they are all 1/4 Japanese. And as we'll talk a little bit later, anybody who had as much as or little as 1/16 Japanese ancestry had to report to the relocation camps on the West Coast during World War II. So all of them would have been part of this. As an overview of what I think about this book, I find it to be credible and reliable to the degree that I can speak to that. And like I said, checking the facts with him, I find him to be reliable. In the Boys in the Book, there were Boys in the Boat. There's a comment about as they win one of the several meets that they are in, he says that the coxswain stood up and sort of celebrated as they crossed the finish line. And he just makes a comment about that. And when I was reading that, I was thinking, well, I wonder if that's really true, or is he just embellishing? And it took me a while, but I was eventually able to find some video from 1930s that actually shows the end of this race with their boat in the distance, and sure enough, he stands up as they cross the finish line. I believe that he's a good historian and a good purveyor of history, and I think he's reliable. I think he's very interesting. I think his writing just is he just uses words very well to define the times that we're talking about and to point out the characteristics of people, and I just find it very interesting. It's not just me who finds him interesting. This book on Goodreads got, the last time I looked, 4.48 out of 5, with several thousand people giving reviews, and that's about the highest I've seen on Goodreads. And even really, really good books come in like 4.1 or 4.2. So a lot of people think he's very interesting. And I think, as I said, he focuses on the personal experiences of individuals and recollections of what they experienced. I wanted to read a little excerpt because this is a book about World War II and the times. And I think his language and his description of the times just really, at least made me really feel like I understood what was going on in American culture. So, pardon me, I'm going to just read for a couple paragraphs here. No Christmas season in modern history was more poignant, emotionally wrought, and traumatic. In the United States and around the world, than that of 1942, a year into which the world's first truly global war, a war on which the sun would never set for another 2.5 years, millions of Americans and their allies sat around cabinet radios that December, thinking about someone who wasn't there, writing them long letters full of small happenings at home, listening with tears in their eyes to Bing Crosby crooning White Christmas. In the United States, 5 million servicemen were away from home. Before the war was over, 16 million would be in uniform. Service flags with blue stars hung on porches and in the front windows of millions of American homes. Each week, at an ever-increasing pace, flags with gold stars replaced them. And he explains, I didn't know this, but the blue stars represent a family member who was in the military, and gold stars represent a family member who was killed in the war. In the South Pacific, as many troops moved in to replace them, thousands of stunned young Marines wearily climbed aboard ships bound for Australia after months of bloody and harrowing fighting in the jungles of Guadalcanal. But thousands of their comrades now lay dead in hastily dug graves on the island they were leaving behind. In the Philippines, captured Americans and Filipinos labored and died by the thousands, bludgeoned, brutalized, and murdered in steaming, stinking, malaria-ridden Japanese POW camps. On the heaving back of the North Atlantic, thousands of merchant marines plotted zigzag courses through towering black seas, their skippers desperately trying to avoid being spotted by German U-boats lurking beneath the surface. In Great Britain, tens of thousands of American, Canadian, Indian, New Zealander, and Australian servicemen and servicewomen joined their British allies celebrating Christmas in pubs and canteens and private homes, downing pints of warm beer, dancing with the locals, tossing darts, and tenderly tasting plum puddings. And at the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland, German SS men erected a Christmas tree for the inmates. Then they piled the bodies of murdered Jews in bowls around the base of the tree as Christmas presents. So going back to a brief history of Japanese immigration, what happened is in Japan, and I think in Asia in general, there was this economic hard times. It sounds like it was basically a major depression in the later 19th century, or mid to late 19th century. So there was a lot of immigration to the United States seeking jobs. A lot from Japan, a lot from other Asian countries. From 1896 to 1924, there were about 200,000 Japanese men who immigrated to Hawaii, and about 180,000 to the mainland, with the vast majority of those being on the West Coast. In 1908, there was sort of an agreement between Japan and the United States to stop the immigration, and so there was very little immigration after 1908, except for women. So wives could join their husbands, and single men who were here could take wives, ranged by family back in Japan, and so it was the time of the picture brides. And so, for instance, Deb's two grandmothers were both picture brides. Then, in 1924, the United States passed the Immigration Act in 1924, which basically halted all immigration from Asia and including from Japan. So it brings up sort of these different generations of Japanese Americans. So the Issei are people, generally men, who immigrated prior to 1924, and because of various laws and Supreme Court decisions, they were forbidden to become U.S. citizens ever, and they were not allowed to own property. The Nisei are those who were born, of the Issei's children who were born in the United States, mostly after 1924, and they were by birth United States citizens. And then the Sansei are the next generation, so like Debbie's a Sansei. And so that this terminology is used throughout the book, and so and Japanese Americans know it. Like when we have family get-togethers, they'll talk about, oh, so and so's a Issei, or was he? You know, they know this terminology. In the 1930s, the United States government was concerned about tensions with Japan, and they started surveilling Japanese communities and trying to identify individuals in those communities who would potentially be risks to our people if there were trouble, in case of trouble with Japan. In 1941, President Roosevelt commissioned Curtis Munson and the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence to assess the risk of Japanese immigrants should there be a war with Japan. They made a report on November 7th, 1941, and the report said that the Japanese problem was non-existent. They said they certified a remarkable, even extraordinary degree of loyalty among this generally suspect ethnic group. And furthermore, they found little evidence to support claims of Japanese American disloyalty. However, December 7th, the day which will live in infamy, the Empire of Japan, and I use the term Empire of Japan to make it clear, we're talking not about Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans are mostly Japanese Americans, but their homeland attacked the United States and the Philippines and Malaysia and Singapore and launched this huge war on December 7th. And so a lot of what I'm going to say, we're going to talk about a lot of things that we as a country did wrong. And I think we need to know that we did some things wrong. And I think, that we can learn for the future. But I also don't want to be judgmental. These were serious times. The Empire of Japan and the Third Reich were truly existential threats to the rest of the world. And so people were scared and they overreacted, and there were wrong things that were done. Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942. And then this executive order and several other orders that were given in the next few weeks basically identified a large portion of the continental United States, which they would call the exclusion zone. So that's all this darker area here. And they established what they call the War Relocation Authority, and this authority made rules, and one of the rules was that any Japanese who lived in that exclusion zone had 6 days to pack their stuff, get whatever they could carry on their body, but they couldn't take cars or wagons or anything, just what they could carry, and they tried to sell their belongings, and they had to report to assembly centers, and then eventually to what they call the relocation camps, while at the same time they were forbidden to move outside of the exclusion. So it's like if you live in California, you might think, well, if I move to Indiana, I'll be all right. But that was illegal. And so this order applied to all people of Japanese ancestry of 1/16 or more. There were foster children and orphans taken from orphanages. There were chronically ill and mentally ill people taken from hospitals. There were bedridden elderly, and all sent to these camps. A comment about the term camps. Deb's family refers to them as camps, and a lot of people refer to them as camps. Mr. Brown makes a point of saying he calls them concentration camps because they were concentration camps. They were not camps like the German concentration camps, but they were barbed wire and armed guards and enforced residency there. So just making that comment. So back to sort of personal story. So I married very well. That was just a few years ago. I married very well. And these are my in-laws, Jiro and Margaret Shimoda, and both of them were teenagers, I think, when this started, and they were both sent to relocation camps. So were all their brothers and sisters, and all four of the grandparents, and pretty much everybody they knew that was of Japanese ancestry were sent to the relocation camps. After the war, well, actually, we'll get to service in the military. My father-in-law actually did serve in the military. Deb's mother's family, after the war, headed east and somehow were able to buy a very modest farm in Michigan, and lived with 6 or 7 siblings, and the grandmother in this really, really humble house for many years, and her father eventually got a college education on the GI Bill, became the first certified CPA in the state of Michigan, and then they got married and they raised a great family, which led to they raised Deb and her 2 brothers and sister, and then Deb and I were able then to this is my mother-in-law and our 4 kids. And then eventually we were able to have this family. And so I'm very thankful to my in-laws for raising such a good family. But that's one of the, so when I read this book, I bought about 10 copies because I would just order it from Amazon and send them to each of my kids. And then some cousins I sent them to, because as I read this book, this is history, you need to know this history because it's very relevant for your family. Also, we talk about this, particularly since this is a Christian group, we just sort of need to face what does God say about treating other people that aren't like us. And I sort of debated whether to include this slide or not, and thought, well, maybe I'll say, well, what's God's opinion? And then, I don't know, it just struck me, God does not have opinions. God has truth. And I think it's just important for us to just say, what's God's command on some of these issues? So, if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. I don't mean this to be any sort of a political statement about what we're supposed to do now, and that I think as Christians we need to say, okay, this is God's word, but the political realities are very, very complicated, and I'm not here to say anything about current politics because I don't know the answer, except I do feel that we need to say, what does the Word of God say? So back to the assembly centers. So when the first Japanese Americans arrived at the assembly centers, some descriptions were that they had small, like 20 by 20 rooms that had nothing in them except metal bed frames and a light hanging from the ceiling. And that would be for like a whole family of 4, 6, 8 people. And they weren't really partitioned into separate units. The partitions went up, not all the way to the ceiling, so you could hear what all the other families around you were saying and doing. The toilets were like just open outhouses. The food was bad. They initially spent 33 cents per day per person on food. And he reported that 12 pounds of fish for 600 people. The women's showers were just open rooms with faucets raining down on them, and there's really no privacy. And a lot of people the food was so bad, there's a lot of diarrhea and GI type illness, and there were long lines for latrines. And I think at night they would stand in line and there'd be guard lights shining down on them, looking at them. But what several people said, by far the worst thing was barbed wire and armed guards for citizens of the United States of America. This is a picture of one of the assembly camps, and this seems to be pretty typical. To be fair, and I think he points this out in the book, it did get better. But a lot of it was due to the work of the Japanese Americans interned there. They initially had to make their own mattresses out of straw and old rags. But they eventually they had social interaction, and the memories of Deb's parents are not all bad. I mean, in some ways, it was good, but they were behind barbed wire and couldn't come and go. So the summer of 42, reading from his comments, and for thousands of young Japanese men and women like them, the summer and fall of 1942 were seasons of profound discontent and angst. Each and every day they confronted fresh reminders, in the starkest terms imaginable, that many of their countrymen saw them not as Americans, but as enemies of all that America stood for and all that they themselves believed in. And there didn't seem to be much that they could do about it. Many of them and their parents, more than 100,000 people now live behind barbed wire in America. Sorry. So in January of 42, the War Department decided that Japanese Americans were not eligible to serve in the Army or in any of the military branches. And they actually wanted to. There were a lot that, at least a significant number, were actually trying to sign up, but they said, no, you are enemy aliens. And so in the winter of 42, that was the case. There is one of the stories in this book is about Gordon Hirabayashi, who was a University of Washington student at the time the war broke out. He believed that the curfew laws and the relocation laws were unconstitutional. He was a Quaker and he was a passive resistor, so he resisted. He didn't flee to Canada. He actually reported to the police, and even when he was told he had to spend time in prison, and in the prison in Arizona, and he actually had to convince some people to drive him to the prison. So he went to prison. He sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the first court, the judge tossed aside constitutional issues, said constitutional rights don't apply. He described these people he said they're shrewd masters of tricky concealment among any who resemble them. With the aid of any artifice or treachery, they seek such human camouflage, and with uncanny skill discover and take advantage of any disloyalty among their kind. And then when he turned to the jury and charged the jury, he said, don't worry about the Constitution. All you are asked to decide, is this person of Japanese ancestry or not? And eventually the Supreme Court still basically decided that the extreme situation of war overrid the concerns of personal liberty. This may be a little sarcastic. I said, oops, we need more men. But the reality was later on, they did need more men, and they decided that the Japanese Americans could register and be part of the army. This resulted in like a tsunami response from Hawaii. They expected a couple hundred people to sign up, and they got, I think, 2,000 within a very short period of time. And many from the camps signed up. One of the characters that recurs in this book is Rudy Tokiwa. He was at Poston, and he's quoted as saying, as an American, it doesn't make no difference if they throw you in a concentration camp. If you can't turn around and be able to stand up later and say, I did my share. Another noted and said, well, if we plan to settle in this country, we better be able to prove ourselves. Nearly every boy there had committed to register by the end of the week. So the response was, it was not uniform, but there was a strong response amongst the young men in the Japanese American relocation camps. This is Hawaii. This is the response that they got. And so the point of this being is many of the young Japanese men really wanted to serve the country and were happy to try to do that. There is a group, and they're called the No-No Boys, and the interned Japanese had to sign it's like a pledge, and there were a number of questions, and then the No-No Boys refused to sign questions 27 and 28, or agreed to 27 and 28, which is, are you willing to serve in combat whenever and wherever you are ordered? And do you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States? And they just felt like it was wrong. They felt they were United States citizens, and no other United States citizens were being asked to sign that, and they just refused. 97% did sign it, but a few percent did, and they called the No-No Boys, and they were generally concentrated at this one relocation camp in Tule Lake, which I think is in Oregon. The ones who did join or be drafted into the military generally went to Camps Shelby in Mississippi, where they were sort of called the Nisei fighting units. They developed the motto, go for broke. It gets a little confusing. I'm not really a military person, so I don't entirely understand the regiments versus units, and he talks a lot, but it seems like most of these are under the umbrella of the 44nd Regimental Combat Team. which also included the 100 Infantry Battalion and the 552nd. But a lot of times he's talking about all of them. He's talking about the 4th, 42nd. He talks about this tension amongst some of the recruits. The ones from Hawaii have a very different outlook than the ones from the mainland United States. I won't get into that much, but the Kotonks were the ones from the mainland, and the Buddha heads were the ones from Hawaii, and they eventually, at first there was a lot of tension, but then they eventually worked together. In terms of their training, 98% of these units passed the physical training requirements, which was the highest rate in the Third Army at that time, and they had the highest average IQ in the entire Army. There was a Colonel Pence, and I did look him up to see, is he related to our recent vice president? And I couldn't tell that he actually is, but he was I think he was from Indiana, so there's probably some relation, but it's not like his father or his brother or anything. But the Colonel Pence is one of the sort of heroes of this story. That he wrote to the mothers. He said, "You've given a soldier to the Army of the United States. I am happy to have him in my command. We shall make a glorious record for the Japanese Americans in our country." And Mr. Brown comments that the soldiers really picked up on the we, and they really felt like their officers they liked their officers. They felt that their officers were leading them and that they were important to the overall war effort. So this is just a little picture of so this unit, these Nisei fighters, were arrived in Italy in, I think, the spring of 1944, and then moved up to Tuscany in June of 1944, and were engaged in some battles. They had about a 10% casualty rate. In July, there was a particular battle to take Hill 140 in Italy. And he describes a lot of things about this battle. He tells of these brothers, Calvin and George Saito, and Calvin was killed in this battle. And George wrote to his father. He says, "Dear Dad, I believe the War Department has notified you of our loss of Calvin. I've just learned of his passing. Dad, this is no time to be preaching to you, but I have something on my chest which I wanted you to hear. In spite of Cal's supreme sacrifice, don't let anyone tell you that he was foolish or made a mistake to volunteer. Of what I've seen in my travels on our mission, I am more than convinced that we've done the right thing, in spite of what's happening in the past. What's happened in the past. America is a damn good country, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Well, Dad, the Germans are beginning to throw a few shells our way. So maybe I better go down to my home. Chin up, Dad, and do take care of yourself. Regards to you, your loving son, George." Unfortunately, George then was killed about 2 weeks later. The 442nd is most known for a series of battles that they sort of called the Gates of Hell. It was in France in the fall of 1944. There was a battalion of Texas, and soldiers almost all from Texas, the 141st Regiment, who was ordered by the general in overall charge to go into the certain area. And it was sort of the officers under him were not so sure that was a good idea. But that 141st got isolated and surrounded. They were under siege. They were running out of food. And so the 442nd was then ordered to go fight up the mountain to liberate the regiment from Texas. They were successful, but they had astonishing losses. They had several hundred men at the beginning, and at the end, there were just a couple dozen who were surviving uninjured. Some quotes from people in the from Texas 141st. "On seeing the Nisei soldiers, thank you, thank you, thank you. Tell them we love them. Hey kids, some balls you got. We thought we was all dead and gone." One said, "Despite that they were generally small and wearing uniforms made for much larger men, pants bunched up around their ankles, honestly, they looked like giants to us." The general then ordered a review of the troops afterwards, and he was upset that he didn't think that they all responded, and he was chewing out the captain, and he said, "Sorry, this is all that's left." In the spring of 1945, they had some more fighting in Germany. They were sent back to Italy to break the Gothic line, which is like a long line of defense between Italy and Europe. They successfully accomplished, quote, "what nobody thought possible," unquote. And they were back in Germany for a while, and some of them actually helped liberate some of the survivors from Dachau. So, in the book, you could read a lot about the horrors of war and the things that these guys went through and the heroic things they did. To summarize, though, so the 442nd was the most decorated military unit of its size and length of service in American history. While conferring posthumous congressional medals of honor, President Clinton said, "Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill served." At one point, Governor John Connolly made the entire 442nd, all of them are honorary Texans. So this is a story about Texans. So in the 442nd, there were 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 28 Silver Stars with oak leaf clusters, 22 Legion of Merit medals, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 1,200 Bronze Stars with oak leaf clusters, 36 Army Commendation medals, 87 Division Commendations, and more than 4,000 Purple Hearts. The 442nd represented 0.11% of the U.S. military force in World War II. They earned 4.4% of the Medals of Honor, and so that's a rate 40 times the rest of the military. When they got back, they weren't always well received. So there's many reports of them being refused service at barbershops, restaurants, stores. Some of them found their former properties with graffiti saying "Japs, keep out." In Seattle, there were 30 families who couldn't find a neighborhood to live in, so they all lived together in a cramped school. The Chamber of Commerce in Salinas, California, did some sort of study and said only 1 in 10,000 residents supported return of the Japanese to their homes. And I think this was in an advertisement placed in the newspaper, but there never was and never will be a Jap that was or ever will be loyal to the United States. The Monterey Peninsula Herald, however, stood up for the right things. And these families have made their homes here for many years and have been part of the life of the community. Their sons are making the same sacrifices as our sons have made. President Truman tried to reverse a lot of the policies. He wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, "These disgraceful actions almost make you believe a lot of our Americans have a streak of Nazi in them." And then to the members of the 442nd at the White House, he said, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won. Keep up the fight, we will win." So some of the individual, these are just like some of the people that he wrote about that were notable. This Sadao Munamori, by all witness accounts, he very intentionally jumped on top of a grenade that was about to go off and saved the lives of several of his fellow officers or soldiers. And James Okubo was a medic who just went above and beyond to bring back and help the injured soldiers in the course of battle. And there's a number of officers there. The men really loved most of the officers. It seemed like there was a very good relationship. They felt like the officers really were happy to go and possibly die with them. So, this is what some American heroes look like. Not all. Well, there's a lot of other really good American heroes, but the members of the 442nd were truly American heroes. This is my father-in-law. He served, but he wasn't part of all the really major stuff we just talked about, but he did serve in the military in Europe at the end of the war. He was a guard at the Nuremberg trials. And his brother, John Shimoda, served in the 442nd in Europe, and he also stayed in the military throughout the Korean War, or the Korean conflict. And he lost a leg when he was serving in Korea. He subsequently served as director of the U.S. Army's Crimes Laboratories, and he passed away just like a year or two ago. And then I've got to show one more slide. Sorry, I just have to show this. So last night, the Michigan won the national championship. So, any comments or questions? Yes?
In your research, did you find out what happened to Children with the research of your?
You know, actually, and I'm glad you asked, because I did look that up. He actually, he had a good career in the military. He served honorably. He made some wrong decisions in those battles, but he went on, I think, to serve in Korea and retired with honor. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you.
Go ahead, Shelley.
I just wondered if in your research, did you, was there anything about how the author chose this subject to write about?
Yes, but I don't remember, because I remember talking about it. I'm not sure, actually. Yeah, I feel bad because I do remember him at the very beginning, the preface, talking a little bit about that. And I know he talks about meeting some of these soldiers. I think he was approached though by, there's an organization, Densho. Do you know what that is, Deb? I think it's like it may be the museum, the Japanese American Museum. I think he was approached by someone, and then he met with some of the survivors, and it went from there. Yes, sir.
One of the members of the 442nd later on became the Senator Inoue of Hawaii, very famous senator.
Yes.
And he was heroic in what he did.
He was, yeah, and actually, I meant to put him on that list. I think maybe Dan Brown didn't want to I don't know why, because he mentions him.
Yes.
And then I looked him up, and yes, he was very heroic.
Yeah.
And he lost, I think, an arm, and he then served in the Senate for many, many years. And he definitely deserves to be on this list of heroes. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I kept thinking, I wish I could talk to my parents. I was a child at this time, and I just wonder when people became aware, how did they gradually find out what was going on? And I'm sure that people in California were aware of it way more than back in the Midwest, but I wish I could ask my parents at what point the general public was aware of what was going on.
Yeah, I don't
And probably not the military stories, I'm sure were not, that would be much later that any of that would have been realized, but anyway.
One comment, I'm just looking on my cell phone here. It says, facing the mountain grew out of conversations Daniel James Brown had with Tom Ikeda, Executive Director of Densho in 2015. And Densho is a Seattle-based nonprofit organization originally dedicated to collecting and preserving the oral histories of Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II. And it goes on to say some other things too. But you must have spent a lot of time with him.
Yeah. It rings a bell of one thing I should mention, because there is some justice in the world. The Supreme Court did reverse a lot of these decisions many years afterwards. They actually felt that the government lied to them in 1942 about the risk from the Japanese population. And so sometime decades later, the Supreme Court reversed the decision. And they also sometime in the latter part of the war did say that it was not constitutional to lock up American citizens. So even during the war, towards the end of the war, it was starting to get sorted out. But then it was maybe several decades before people really understood what had gone on. So, okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. It was very interesting. That's okay, go ahead with your cleanup, but it was really an interesting book. It's, once again, makes us realize how important history is. And if we don't know history, what should we know? Yeah. So, thank you all for coming today. And let's see, on February the 13th is our next one, and that'll be Morgan Fuller. And she's going to be reviewing the Second Life of Muriel West.
That's quite a book.
It is. I've read it. I've thoroughly, if you haven't read it yet, I really recommend it. It's another eye-opener. And yeah, very good book. So thanks again for coming, and Happy New Year, if I haven't said that yet. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was supposed to mention that we have a book that the library had cleared out, and